to the Vinnie Eastwood Show. We have something very special for you right now. A little bit of info on Australian sovereignty, as it turns out. Our special guest today is Wayne Levitt, coming at us from the nice desert state of Australia. Wayne, welcome to the show, mate.
Thank you for having me.
You're very, very welcome. Now, you were telling me that you have some, unconventional news to spread, and you have chosen specifically to lay it on us here at the Vinnie Eastwood Show. I would love it if you could just preface for myself as well as the listeners just exactly who you are and what it is you're doing, mate.
I used to be principal solicitor of a small legal firm in the western suburbs of Sydney. We engaged in litigation, principally crime. Most other solicitors tend to do conveyancing, which is buying and selling of real estate and so forth. And as a consequence, because we did litigation, we weren't. And as luck would have it, I was just about to close the office early and give myself an early break for the weekend when a call came through. My secretary was speaking to someone else on the other line. I took the call, and it was a strange man telling me a strange story about how the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act was invalid and how the Governor-General of Australia wasn't properly appointed and how Queen Elizabeth II was a war criminal, stuff like that. I should have told him to keep taking the medication and I'd give him a call on Monday, but because I was a bit bored, I said, have you got any material you could forward to me? And he sent me 4.5 pages by way of fax. I read that material and I was shocked. I spent the next 6 weeks, every spare moment that I had, trying to prove the material to be incorrect, but everything I found, in fact, confirmed its truth. I got involved with some people who were heading an organisation trying to rectify Australia's horrendous constitutional problems, and as a consequence of bringing a number of cases in various courts of Australia, including the High Court of Australia, I lost my practicing certificate, so I could no longer work as a solicitor, and that happened on the 28th of November 2000.
And what have you been doing since being out of the job as a solicitor? Because there's an awful lot of there's an awful lot of work out there for people who have a sharp mind such as yours.
It's very difficult when you've got the Law Society and the New South Wales State Government and the Australian Government on your back. They really hate the information that I've found and the information that I'm continuing to find about Australia's constitutional problems. It's not only Australia, it also affects New Zealand and Canada, and it's having a lot of impact on the world, and therefore it's been very difficult for me.
So specifically, you said that the Australian Constitution is void and the Queen is a war criminal. Could you divulge more into detail about this? Yeah,
sure. Bear in mind, this also applies to New Zealand and Canada, but if your listeners are interested, they'll have to do their own research. But the broad parameters of what I'm saying apply to all of those countries. In 1900, the Parliament at Westminster, the British Parliament, passed into law the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. That Act defines the Commonwealth of Australia as a self-governing colony of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Already there's a problem. There hasn't been a United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland since about 1922. It's now the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So the Queen that's mentioned, or the King that's mentioned in Australia's Constitution as sovereign of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland hasn't existed since 1922. That also applies to Canada and New Zealand. So that's a big problem. Second problem, Australia, New Zealand, Canada are defined as colonies of the United Kingdom. If that's the case, and if these Constitution Acts are still valid, how can these countries be members of the General Assembly of the United Nations and have any of the treaties that they've signed, are they now up for grabs because they've been signed by countries that are defined in their constitutions, which is the first document at the top of the pyramid, the first legal document that defines everything else. Those constitutions define those countries as colonies, and colonies cannot be represented in the General Assembly of the United Nations. This may sound all very esoteric, but it's not. The Japanese government has this information. Currently, the Australian government has a case in the International Court of Justice against the Japanese for whaling in Australian Antarctic waters. And the Japanese have this information and intend to use it to prevent that court case going anywhere, because Australia doesn't have standing. You have to be a nation to take a case in the International Court of Justice, and our Constitution defines us as a colony. I'll give you another example. Just from in history, you get unanimous votes. Everybody in your electorate votes you in. And you present an act, a bill of law to the New Zealand Parliament. Let's call it the ABC Act. And everybody in Parliament is so taken aback and amazed by what you've done that it gets a unanimous vote all through the Parliament. That bill of law cannot become an act of law until it gets the royal signature, the signature of Queen Elizabeth II, who herself, in fact, is appointed by the British Parliament at Westminster. But her signature is given by her vice-regal representative, which is a Governor-General. Now, that Governor-General may have been chosen by the New Zealand Prime Minister or the New Zealand Parliament, but nonetheless they're appointed by a queen, a foreign queen halfway around the world, who herself has been appointed by a foreign parliament, the Westminster Parliament. So the way that sovereignty works out is, you got the Westminster Parliament, you got Queen Elizabeth, and you've got her representative in New Zealand. It works out is, you got the Westminster Parliament, you got Queen Elizabeth, and you've got her representative in New Zealand, and then the people come way down the bottom, fourth. That's how the system works, and the Japanese know about this. Various other nations know about this. The Chinese are aware of it, the Sri Lankans, the Burmese. If you leave New Zealand, you get a New Zealand passport. If you get into trouble overseas, that passport is next to useless, because if push comes to shove, the country that you're in will say to the New Zealand government, well, how can you issue a passport for the nation of New Zealand when your constitution defines you as a colony of the UK? This happened to a gentleman in Australia, well, a Chinese-born gentleman by the name of Stern Hu. You can look him up on the internet, S-T-E-R-N Hu, H-U. He came to Australia, he took Australian citizenship, he went back working for BHP in China, and now he's in a Chinese jail, and the Australian government have their hands tied behind their back. They put too much pressure on the Chinese government. That government will announce to the world the constitutional problems of Australia, and Australia's currency and stock market have got about 24 hours life left in them.
Is this by chance why Stephen Harper closed down the Canadian Parliament for 90 to 120 days because the Governor-General?
To be honest, I'm not aware. I'm not that au fait with what's going on in Canada and New Zealand, because I'm putting all my effort into Australia. But I can tell you one other thing. Assuming I am wrong, assuming that the Australian Constitution is valid, we have proof that back in the 1990s, a Governor-General of Australia was appointed by a forged document. And remember this, if the root is poisoned, the fruit is poisoned. What happened was, we got hold of an appointment document for an Australian Governor-General, and we went over and organised a meeting with the UK's Lord Chancellor, who at the time was a gentleman by the name of Baron Falconer. When that document was slid across the desk to him, before it had even stopped sliding, he said, "That's a forgery." We said, no, this actually came from the government printer's office in Canberra. He said, no, that's a forgery, because the royal seal, the design of the royal seal on that document was changed, and this document is dated after the design of the royal seal was changed. Not only that, the royal seal went from the custody of the Foreign Secretary, who at the time was Jack Straw, to me, and I never put the royal seal on that document.
This is the same Jack Straw
yes.
that blocked investigations of abuse of children and stuff like that in state institutions.
We call him Strawman Jack. We then went and investigated the public record, and we found that the Queen was nowhere near the place specified on the face of the appointment document on the date the appointment document was allegedly signed. Now, we had a good idea, and I don't think that this person did it out of the goodness of their heart. I reckon they got some Australian taxpayers' money put into a bank account somewhere. And if that happened in Australia, and it did, and we can prove it, then it's fair to say that it's probably happened for New Zealand and Canada as well.
Well, it turns that our not our Governor-Generals, our Chief Justices and Justice Ministers meet behind closed doors every year to coordinate legislation. And it's all behind closed doors, so nobody knows how the legislation is going through. And it's very apparent to me that the levels of secrecy concerning government and the actual reality behind it are tops. You know, it's almost as if you can't outdo this level of secrecy because the public is completely in the dark, about as in the dark as you can get, really. And, shedding light on this subject becomes the of research it takes to, in fact, back it up. Now, you're not talking about this as if you're just, you made it up or anything. You've actually got documentation, and even you've sent me some with the Buckingham Palace logo on it. And can you explain to me just how the real ruling system actually works here? I mean, currently the perception is the people elect their representatives, and their representatives then rule the country. That's not the case, is it?
No, I'm not going to say it's a conspiracy. I'll leave that to others. But you'll find if you do internet searches, for example, at the moment, there are a lot of pubs closing down in the United Kingdom. There are a lot of pubs closing down in Australia and all over the world, and they're closing down for the same reasons, taxation and anti-smoking legislation. That's one example. If you look up power prices all around the world, power prices are rising. Prices all around the world, power prices are rising. All these things generally tend to be coordinated, and what we have tried to do is use this information to try and make it as difficult as we can for the Australian government to force them to actually rectify the situation and give the Australian people back the ability to have a say in how they're governed, because at the moment it's a joke. It's just a joke. I'll give you another example about how this is being used against probably New Zealand, but definitely Australia. Australia has been given vast territories in the Antarctic, and those territories are being given by the UN. The Americans currently have bases on Australia's Antarctic territories, hundreds of people down there looking for resources in allegedly Australia's Antarctic territory. And the reason that they're down there, and the reason the Japanese are down there hunting for whales in our territory, is because they understand that the United Nations can't give a colony or not, territory. You have to be a nation. And these people know that Australia's not a nation. I assume that a similar attitude exists towards New Zealand, and the New Zealand government and the Australian government won't do anything about it because their lives are pretty good at the moment, and they've got great superannuation and pension payouts, so they'll just keep the people in the dark and do the best they can.
Keeping the people in the dark is not that easy either. It requires quite the massive budget, methinks.
Sure.
And where exactly does all this money come from?
Very interesting question. I know in the case of the bribery that has obviously gone on here, I can't prove it, but the bribery that's gone on to places, for example, the Jack Straw and so forth, would have come from the Australian taxpayer, so that they can keep travelling around the world on passports that are not worth the paper they're written on. And I assume the same happens in New Zealand and Canada. It's a very similar system. But the reason this initially happened 100 years ago, Britain had the strongest navy in the world, bar none. They had all these colonies, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and these countries really didn't have much in the way of military wherewithal. So they decided, look, it's all right, we've got basically autonomy, we're self-governing, we can always rely on Mother England to protect us. What happened was, towards the end of the First World War, the Great War, the war to end all wars, Woodrow Wilson, who in my opinion has to be America's worst president, decided that in order to stop the internecine warfare and the bloodletting, he would organise an international body which came to be known as the League of Nations. Now, the British realised that if they kept all their colonies, those colonies wouldn't get a vote, because you have to be a nation to join the League of Nations. So what they did surreptitiously towards the end of the First World War was they granted New Zealand, Australia, Canada, South Africa their doing this because of the great sacrifices you've made for us during the Great War. South Africa took that opportunity and became an independent and sovereign nation. In Australia, New Zealand and Canada, the politicians fudged it because they thought, well, if we do this, we won't be able to rely on Mother England to protect us. And that's why this freedom, which was granted by the British in order to ensure that their former colonies could join the League of Nations, and hoping, quite correctly, that those colonies would still vote along the lines that Mother England wanted and thereby stop America from dominating this new international body. That's why it was done. But the politicians fudged it and said, no, let's keep going with our with our colonial constitutions, we'll keep getting our power and our privileges, and the people won't know any better. And frankly, that's what's happened. So, Australia is supposed to be an independent nation, and yet we are the only OECD country in the world which doesn't have a constitutionally enforceable Human Rights Act. Because at the time our constitution was formed, and you'll find this is the same for New Zealand, there was no point in putting human rights into the constitution. Because at the time, all of those people in New Zealand, Australia, Canada were all colonies, and they could all go back and rely on the human rights that had been enshrined in British law. So there was no point in repeating them in those constitution acts. But when those countries became independent and free, the government fudged it and never brought in referendums for new constitutions, and that's why Australia, to this day, still doesn't have a constitutionally enforceable Bill of Rights. And we're supposed to be an independent, sovereign, free nation.
Yeah. I mean, that's the irony, isn't it? Because as soon as you get freedom, it requires the sign off of somebody who basically has a vested interest in making sure that you don't have it. Right? So it's pretty likely, you give freedom, nah. And that's why I think everybody throughout history who's ever wanted independence or something has had to go to war for it.
Well, we're trying. It's very hard to get John and Elsie Lunchbucket from in front of the television. So we're trying to do this by causing as much economic problem as we can, which we're hoping will force the Australian government and thereafter the New Zealand and Canadian governments to rectify the horrendous situation that we currently have. As more and more people, if we can get enough publicity for what is going on in Australia, if we can get this story out there, eventually someone in America, someone who's a manager of a retirement fund, is going to find out that all the companies and all the corporations that they've got their members' retirement funds invested in don't actually exist at law.
You're listening to the Vinnie Eastwood Show.
Have a dispute with, say, an American corporation or a Singapore corporation, if it goes to an international court, this material will be raised, and this will cause horrendous problems. And we're hoping that the managed retirement fund people in America, when they realise this, will divest from places like Australia and New Zealand, where they do have a lot of investments. And when that happens, the stock market will be affected, the currency will be affected, and the government of those countries is going to have to say, look, we have to sort this thing out. We can't let our economies go down the drain. That's what we're hoping.
Well, it sounds like Agenda 21 to me, trying to force the developed world into a post-industrial feudal state, more or less, so that they can be easily swallowed up and controlled by international bankers, more or less with the world government, otherwise known as the New World Order. And one of the main elements that you can look at to see how society is starting to be channeled along a certain path to tyranny, more or less. And what you're telling me seems no different.
The United Nations, we originally thought, when I got involved in this 13 years ago, we originally took the statements of the United Nations at face value. And some of their treaties, International Treaty on Human Rights and so forth, when you read them on the page, are very, very good. Problem is, that's their public face. But their private and their true face is they do not want to get involved in any of this because they don't want to give Australia, New Zealand and Canada their sovereignty. The last thing they want is for nations to have their sovereignty, and that's why they're not interested. We served it's a 400-page document. You can look it up on the internet. It's called Australia, the Concealed Colony. You type that in. Personally, on every single member state of the General Assembly of the UN, back I think it was in 1999, and nothing came of it. There have been meetings held with Kofi Annan's staff. Kofi Annan was given a 2-volume set of Australia the Concealed Colony, which was covered in kangaroo skin. So it wasn't a cheap paperback, it was a very nice edition, and we heard nothing because they are not interested in freedom and sovereignty. They've got their own agenda, which isn't a very good one in my opinion.
I mean, and let's not forget, of course, that the Security Council at the UN are the ones who actually run the show, because they all have veto powers, and the General Assembly is no more than a tokenistic representation of the slave states.
I'd agree. What we're doing is we're trying to get nations, various nations around the world, I won't mention who they are, but about some horrible government somewhere denying the people human rights and so forth. A number of people in Australia contact that government and forward them the requisite information so that it prevents nations like America and Britain and Britain's colonies from doing anything to alleviate the situation. It's the only tactic we've got. We intend to make the whole system break down until such time as it becomes unworkable. And these governments have to tell the truth to the people.
Well, they should have been doing so the whole time, but they simply don't tell the truth to the people, really, do they, Wayne? I mean, and they rule by manipulation and deception. And Helen Clark, who's supposedly one of the most popular prime ministers in our history, I mean, obviously passing great laws like banning vitamins, deception, and Helen Clark, who's supposedly one of the most popular prime ministers in our history. I mean, obviously passing great laws like banning vitamins, sending troops to Afghanistan, and doing all things which are remarkably unpopular and globalist in nature. Guess where she gets promoted to? The third highest spot at the UN, because she's shown that she's just that nice of a servant to her globalist masters.
I agree.
And this is a similar thing going on all over the place, isn't it, Wayne?
Yes. The main problem that I find is when you try and explain the horrendous situation, for example, that Australia is in, when you try and explain that to your average Australian, you'll notice their eyes glass over really quickly, because Dancing with My Sister...
Yeah. I mean, and it's almost as if the elements of human life that used to be important, for example, family, social interaction, intellectual development, being able to go out in nature and stuff like that and fit in and play with the animals, swim in a stream or any of that kind of stuff, is no longer the motivation or even enters into the general populace mind. And we have such a record amount of morons, I would probably say. People who have a attention span of approximately 30 seconds. People who have the capacity of accepting concepts that maybe a 9 or a 10-year-old would be able to deal with, And at the same time, we, in this movement, regardless of what it is, it's the freedom movement, right? That is the frustration for us, because we know what's going on, and being able to communicate it to somebody in 30 seconds is, I would probably venture a guess, impossible.
I agree. It's very sad. One of the things I've noted is if you ask people, have you read any good books lately, the vast majority will tell you that they don't read books, they rely on the internet. And one of the symptoms that the internet causes is a short attention span.
Hey, and that is a great way to have an incredibly shallow society, isn't it? One who votes for a prime minister based upon his looks. I talked to a friend the other day, a good friend of my brother, and he said that the reason why he voted for the new super city mayor of Auckland, Len Brown, I asked him, do you know any of his policies? And he says no. And then he continued to tell me why he voted for him.
Listeners can check up on the internet. Go and do a Google search for the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. And when they find it, have a look at Section 42. Section 42 of that Act states that when you become a member of the House of Representatives or Senate, you must take the oath as given in the schedule to the Constitution Act. You then go to the back of the Act and you'll see the schedule. If you then go to YouTube and type in Julia Gillard swearing in, you'll see it's about a 3-minute film clip of Julia Gillard being sworn in as Prime Minister by our Governor-General. And she is not taking the oath as prescribed in the schedule to the Australian Constitution. We have no say in this. The preamble to the Australian Constitution Act and the schedule to the Act cannot be changed. The only thing we can change is a thing called Clause 9, which is known as the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. If Julia Gillard doesn't swear the oath as prescribed in Section 42 and given in the schedule to the Australian Constitution Act, she is not Prime Minister. And this is on YouTube. You can see it on YouTube. And I can tell you what, there's a lot of people in Japan and China who've watched that YouTube clip and had a look at Section 42 of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. They know about it, and when push comes to shove, the Australian government is going to be pushed and shoved so hard they won't know whether they're Arthur or Martha. Australia's anti-whaling case in the International Court of Justice is going nowhere. So for all those people who enjoy seeing whales getting killed and the water going pink, you're going to have a lot more of that this year because it's coming up.
Sushi on! Hey, well, I was just thinking, you made me think there for a second. Sushi on! Hey, well, I was just thinking, you made me think there for a second. A while back, we had one of our politicians in New Zealand, well, I can't remember what he did wrong, but anyway, he got out of Parliament, and the person who got sworn in to replace him, and this was broadcast live on the radio, the oath that you take in New Zealand as a parliamentarian is not to the people of New Zealand, not to uphold the law, nothing like that. It is specifically to the Queen and all her successors, you know.
And the Queen, and this is important, the Queen is not a hereditary Queen. The Queen is appointed by Act of Parliament. People think that Prince Charles is the next in line to become king. No. The Westminster Parliament says, for example, that if you are a Catholic, you cannot become sovereign of the United Kingdom. The Westminster Parliament therefore prescribes who can to make my dog King of the UK. So it's not as if the Queen is above Parliament. Parliament is supreme. The Westminster Parliament, they appoint the Queen. The Queen then appoints governors and governors-general of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and then the people come last. And the oath that you're talking about is the identical oath contained in the schedule to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. So the people can go take a running leap. They're not important. It's some foreign, sour, emotionally crippled old woman half a world away who herself has been appointed by a foreign parliament. And we're supposed to be independent sovereign nations. The Japanese know about it. The Chinese know about it. All these nations in the world know about it. They haven't broadcast it because they're keeping it up their sleeve and they're using it as and when required. So if you're a New Zealand citizen or a Canadian citizen and you go overseas to an unfriendly country and you get into a spot of bother, don't expect your government to step in and help you. Expect your government to step in and help you.
Yeah,
because they can't.
It's like Ron Paul asking Ben Bernanke of the Federal Reserve, you know, what did you do with the taxpayer money? And the answer is, we don't have to tell you.
That's right.
Now, wrapping up here, do you have a website that people can go to there, Wayne?
We did. It was taken down.
Of course.
The current website, we've had a lot of trouble. The current website we have, which is still in the process of being rebuilt, is worldwideweb.basic-fraud.com. Our original website was basicfraud.com. This is basic-fraud.com. I'd also say go to Google and look up Australia, the Concealed Colony. You can also go to Google and look up David Claude Fitzgibbon. Fitzgibbon is spelt with a Z. He was the Australian courts and ultimately to the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights threw his case out, not because any of his evidence or documentation was wrong, but because they maintained that no human rights offence had taken place. I've got suspicions as to how that happened, and I wouldn't be surprised if money changed hands. I'll give you another example about the British justice, how good it is. When David Claude Fitzgibbon, who's a barrister himself, was before the High Court in Britain. His case was being heard by Justice Lightman. Lightman heard the case and reserved his decision. Between the time when he finished hearing the case and giving his decision, the Australian Prime Minister at the time, John Winston Howard, flew to London. Now, I remember seeing this, and I couldn't get it through my head that John Winston Howard, a former solicitor, would be so gross as to go to London to judge in his decision. But that is exactly what happened. And we know that for a fact because after Lightman gave his decision against Fitzgibbon, the Sheriff of the court came down and said to Mr Fitzgibbon, Justice Lightman would like to see you in chambers. Fitzgibbon was shocked. He went to the judge's chambers and Lightman said to him, look, we're having a little bit of a party tonight in my former Inns of Court. We don't get too many people from Australia in our court, so I'm wondering whether you'd like to come along. Fitzgibbon said, okay, I will. So that night he's with Justice Lightman and senior counsel in the Inns of Court in London. Lightman gets a few drinks into him and says to Fitzgibbon, the problem was that John Howard, your Prime Minister, came over and pressured me to decide the case against you, but if you go to Europe, I'm sure you'll do a lot better. And all the senior counsel in the Inns of Court who knew about this all mentioned how disgusted they were that the Prime Minister of Australia had come over and interfered with a British judge. Fitzgibbon is a barrister in Australia. He was there and he can tell you this. This is a sort of corruption, the endemic corruption.
It's just the kind of corruption we need. Just the kind of corruption